Welcome back to part 3 of 4.
Well, we've been talking about information a little bit. There's a whole field of science called information theory that deals with how information is transmitted and so on and where it comes from. And we sort of know what information is. I mean, you pick up a book and it's got information in it. But how do we define it? Well, we found that a good definition of it entails 3 quantities. I'm simplifying this a little bit for time's sake. But basically, information always involves a code system, a symbolic code system. So when you pick up a book and it's got a word like lion in it, you don't actually see a lion there. You don't see the animal. You see a word that represents the animal. Okay, so it's symbolic. It's a code system. It always entails language. Most of the books you read are probably English, but there are other languages as well. There are computer languages and all kinds of different languages that have syntax and grammar and rules of that nature. And there's meaning. When you read a book, there's something that you can learn from it. There's an expected action. There's an intended purpose. When you read a cookbook, the expected action is that you'll produce the product that it's describing how to make, and the purpose is so you can eat something. Okay, and so that's an example of information. So here's a possible example of information. Could this be information? Well, it could be. It looks like there might be a code system there. It turns out it is information, and the way you can tell is you can decode it. If you decode it and it means something, then you know you've got information, right? And it turns out this is actually Genesis 1 through 5, right? Let's take a look at it here. It says, in the beginning, the clipboard, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so on. Well, you can read the rest of that there, but you can see it's Genesis told in a sort of a symbolic form, using different symbols than we're normally acquainted with. So, really interesting, isn't it? But when you have information like that, and we know this has information because we can decode it, when you have information, certain rules apply, certain laws of nature, just like you have the law of conservation of energy. That applies when you have energy. So there are laws of information. Dr. Werner Gitt, one of the world's experts on information theory, says there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. That appears to be a law of nature.
Okay, so in the couple of minutes I spent Googling Dr. Werner Gitt, I was not able to find what he actually got his degree in. But since he taught engineering, I would hazard a guess that it was some kind of engineering degree. And before he retired, he became the head of the Department of Information Technology. Now, in case you don't know, information technology is dealing with computers, not information theory. So at best it just means he's good with computers, and not in any way an expert on information theory. As for the papers he has written, I could write papers on Hungarian beetle clocks, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert on beetle clocks or even that beetle clocks actually exist. In order to be an expert on something, other experts have to acknowledge that you're an expert and you know what you're talking about. So let's have a look at what the experts think of Dr. Gitt's work on information theory. Well, they seem to think he doesn't understand the basics of information theory. Now let's look at his quote again. Almost all of it is weird and I have some issues with it. For starters, I'm going to assume originate by itself means poof into existence by itself. But if that happens as a result of a process or a sequence of events, then it wouldn't be by itself. So those two parts are completely pointless. Then we have the in matter part. This feels like some sort of qualifier, like he thinks information can't poof into existence by itself in already existing matter, but he has no problems with the idea of a table poofing into existence by itself.
That information never arises spontaneously. And so, if you put a typewriter in a box and just let it sit there or just jumble it around like that randomly, it's not going to produce a work of Shakespeare. It's not going to do it.
I think you're trying to build another straw man here and trying to conflate that DNA is like the work of Shakespeare. It's not. It's more like the results you'd get from a monkey with a typewriter. Also, the typewriter, which I think is your analogy for the mechanisms responsible for changing DNA. But they don't exist in a box isolated from the rest of the universe. They are more like a monkey with a typewriter.
Okay? Despite what students may want, they put their homework in there and just shake it up. It's not going to do it for you. It's not going to produce any new information. We sort of know that.
Well, no, it won't produce new information, but it will change existing information. For example, some of the papers might get crumpled and torn. if you have any writing utensils in there, they might break and mark things up. So, like with evolution, there is no set outcome, and it's stupid to expect your homework to be completed. But you can expect there to be some sort of change.
Well, where does information come from? A mind.
We have never seen or experienced any new information come from a mind. Minds have only changed already existing information. For example, when a person builds a table, they don't just poof it into existence. They take already existing information in the form of wood and turn it into a table.
Ultimately. Now, information can be copied, and it doesn't have the process of copying doesn't have to be a mental process, but the source of information is always a mind.
Information can be copied without a mind, but the source of information is always a mind? So what you're saying is that the works of Shakespeare are capable of poofing duplicates of themselves into existence, but there has to be a mind to poof the first one into existence? So why have we never seen anything poof a copy of itself into existence? And why have we never seen a mind poof anything into existence? With so many minds and non-minds in the world, you would have expected something to have happened by now.
And that also appears to be a law of nature.
No, your statement is quite inconsistent with what we have observed in nature.
When its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender.
Okay, now that you have read that quote you had up, I'll address it. For starters, it's completely wrong. No mind in the history of the world has ever been the source of new information. They have only ever been just another link in the chain of events.
So what he's saying there is that information can be copied many times. I mean, if you have information in a book, where did that information come from? Probably from a machine that makes lots of books simultaneously, right? Well, where did the machine get its information? From a computer, probably. Where did it get its information? From another computer. You trace it backwards, eventually you'll end up with a mind. Somebody wrote it. If it's creative information, it always goes back to a mind.
No, just because you stopped looking when you came to a mind does not mean that that's where the chain of events started. All event chains go back to the Big Bang, and science isn't even sure that that's where they started.
There are no known exceptions to this. This is a law of nature.
Repetition does not make your statement any more true.
Now, that's very interesting because, of course, in DNA, what do we have? Information. Yeah. And it's been copied many times. The information in your DNA, you got it from your parents, and they got it from their parents. It's been copied many times, but ultimately it has to go back to a mind.
Yep, I knew this is where you were going. And of course, like Dr. Gitt, you don't understand information theory, so it's kind of only to be expected that you would get this wrong.
And see, that makes sense in the creation worldview, because information goes back to, all the way back to Adam and Eve, and they got it from God.
Oh, right. I completely forgot that you had a reason for not understanding information theory. And for a few moments there, I thought you were just an idiot talking about things you don't understand. Thank you for reminding me.
And the original organisms that God created, they got their information and their DNA from God.
Wow. Citation needed.
The information's been copied many times into our present state, and some of it's been lost.
But if information is capable of poofing copies of itself into existence, as you previously stated, then how can information ever be lost?
Due to mutations and natural selection.
Both of those things don't lose information, they change it.
And we have some little problems from time to time. You have lower back pain or hair loss or whatever it is. That's due to little mistakes that have crept into the human genome.
Actually, back pain is more evidence that humans weren't intelligently designed, because back pain is usually caused by the human spine not being good design for a creature that walks upright.
But really, information is not compatible with evolution.
I assume you mean information theory and not just information. In which case, the only reason you don't think information theory and evolution are compatible is because you don't understand either information theory nor evolution.
And you know, the funny thing is, in their heart of hearts, evolutionists know that information does not come about by chance.
Chance is not a mechanism by which evolution works. You're using another straw man.
They know it always goes back to a mind.
A mind has never been demonstrated to be the source for anything. Furthermore, you're making a claim of absolute knowledge about what goes on in the minds of everyone.
And I did a little social experiment to prove this a while back.
You did a social experiment to prove that you know what goes on in the minds of everyone? Such an experiment would have had to include everyone, and since I've never heard of it before, I can reasonably conclude that it didn't include everyone. So it's invalid right from the get-go.
There was an article that appeared on my blog. I have a blog, jasonlyle.com, and there was an article that appeared on there called On the Origin of Articles by Means of Natural Selection. You get the idea. Okay, and so the article tries to persuade you that articles have no authors.
Well, it would have to do more than try to persuade people. It would also have to demonstrate that articles could have been written without an author.
That they are just an accumulation of typos. And most typos make an article worse, but occasionally a typo, you might imagine, might make an article better. And so those are preserved and copied, and eventually articles get longer and better as they're copied over millions of years, right?
Well, an interesting thought experiment that might be. It would still need to be demonstrated that articles do undergo a process of mutation and natural selection before anyone can take it as true.
And that explains why articles use, for example, the same words, like the word "the" is in many different articles. Now, how could that be unless they're biologically related?
Well, articles have never been demonstrated to have any biological or evolutionary mechanisms. And I've already explained why we can expect to find the same words used in multiple articles earlier, when I used machine code to talk about what we can expect to find in intelligently created things. So as a short refresher, if an article was intelligently designed, then to someone who didn't know the language, they would see the same words used over and over again, but they would seem to be placed randomly and in random order to each other, which is exactly what we do find even if we compare two articles written by the same person.
From a common ancestor, right? Anyway, it goes through and tries to persuade you using all of the tricks that evolutionists use.
Biologists don't use tricks. They use evidence to demonstrate that evolution is true.
To persuade you that articles have no authors, but are merely the random chance process guided by typos and natural selection.
Which you would still need to demonstrate.
And the funny thing is, when this appeared on I can't take credit for writing it because it would defeat the purpose, but when it appeared on my blog, a lot of evolutionists chimed in. I allow people to comment on that. And they said, "We know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle." I said, How do you know? How do you know that I wrote it? Did you see me write it?
Well, while that is kind of a dumb response to your article, your response to his response is even dumber. He wouldn't have to see you write it to know that you wrote it. For starters, no mechanism has been demonstrated to produce an article other than being authored. No other mechanism has been demonstrated for articles to get onto your blog than you putting them there. And lastly, the article says you posted it right there on your own screenshot. It is therefore very reasonable to conclude that you wrote and posted the article in question.
No, you're taking it on faith? That's not very scientific, is it?
No, he's taking it on evidence for which you authoring and posting the article is overwhelming. There is absolutely no faith involved.
Well, we know what? That it's got information in it? See, they can't go that way because DNA has information in it.
I think that was a straw man, but it's completely nonsensical and I can't make heads or tails of it.
So if they say information requires a creator, I've got them. And they can't, and yet they couldn't figure out any other way to say it.
Yep, that's definitely a straw man. I don't think anyone is arguing that you must have wrote it because it contains information. The argument would be that you must have written it because the information it contains is consistent with what we'd expect to find if it was intelligently designed. Furthermore, no other mechanisms have been demonstrated that might explain a different origin for your article.
Well, we've seen other people write art. Yeah, but did you see me write this one? Well, no. Well, then, that's pretty much blind faith. I mean, if you want to believe that way, fine, but keep it in church, man.
Creationists really like to fight with their strawmen.
You'll have to get on there later and look at some of the comments. It was really funny, and it was fun for me to play the part of the evolutionist for a change, because I got to use the same fallacies that they use in defending their position.
Wow, the projection is strong with this one.
And none of them could really defend their position without giving up evolution, you see.
I would like to point out again that your position is so weak that you even had to lie to defeat your own strawman.
It's really interesting. SETI is another example of proof that evolutionists really do know that information comes from intelligence.
How is SETI in any way proof that information can only come from intelligence?
You've heard of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They have these radio dishes pointed out into space, listening for alien signals, alien radio signals. Now, there are lots of radio signals in space, ladies and gentlemen. The sun gives off radio. I can listen to that. It sounds like static, kind of. There are other stars give off radio signals. Galaxies do. There are things called pulsars that give off these little pip, 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 like that, these regular pulses. So with all these radio sources out in space, how would you distinguish an intelligent radio transmission from all of these natural ones?
Well, that is a really difficult question to answer. The only real way would be to somehow identify a signal pattern that could only have been intelligently designed. And there are a lot of computers all over the world running pattern recognition software trying to find patterns that can only have been intelligently designed. But currently, the only pattern we could really be sure of is something like a long series of prime numbers, or some other signal made specifically to be identified by other intelligent life forms.
And of course, the folks at SETI would tell you, well, of course, the intelligent signal would have information in it, right?
No, the intelligent signal would have characteristics that could only come from an intelligent source.
It'll have some kind of meaningful message. Indeed, if we got instructions from space on how to build a warp drive, and we built it and it worked, wow, that would probably convince even me that there's probably life out there. I don't think there is life out there, but it would convince me, wouldn't it? Because, hey, information always comes from a mind.
Repeatedly asserting that isn't evidence for it, nor does that make it any more true.
And yet you point that in the other direction. You have them look through a microscope at DNA. That didn't come from a mind. That's just random chance. All that information.
You clearly have no idea what information is. All radio waves are themselves information, even the ones from non-intelligent sources. It's possible to tell information from intelligent sources from non-intelligent ones because we have analogs that we know came from intelligent sources to compare them to. If it matches one of our intelligently designed analogs, then we can say with reasonable certainty that it was also intelligently designed. If it doesn't match one of our analogs, then we can't say that it was intelligently designed. DNA, for example, does not match our intelligently designed analogs, so we cannot say that it was intelligently designed.
It's inconsistent. It shows that in their heart of hearts they really do know God.
Just because your straw man is inconsistent doesn't mean the actual arguments are. Also, another claim to absolute knowledge about what goes on in everyone's head.
Well, let's talk about geology now, the study of rocks, and we'll include fossils in this as well.
Great. After demonstrating that you don't understand biology or information theory, I can't wait to see how you don't understand geology.
The first misimpression that I have to clear up here, because people think, well, haven't rocks been radiometrically proven to be billions of years old, right? And people have misconceptions about that. They just think it's almost like magic. You take up your rock, you hold your tricorder out, you scan it, and there it is, millions of years old, right? Well, really, it's more complicated than that. I'm going to kind of sum it up here for you briefly. It's again more complicated than this, but basically there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable. We call them, they're said to be radioactive. And what that means is they will spontaneously change into another type of atom. You don't have to, there's no external force necessary. Uranium-238, for example, will spontaneously change into the next atom, which changes into the next one, and so on, all the way down to lead-206. Lead-206 is not radioactive, it's stable, and so once you're lead-206 forever, you are lead-206, unless there's some kind of outside force. But fortunately, only a small fraction of atoms are of the radioactive variety, so you don't have to worry about changing into something else within the next 24 hours anyway. Now, the idea is this process, at least for some atoms like uranium, is very, very slow. Atom by atom, one popping into the next, and so on. And so the idea is if you had a chunk of solid uranium and you waited long enough, it would be part uranium and part lead with some of the intermediate elements as well. And eventually it would be all lead. That's the idea. And so you can use that like a clock because the rate is known. And it's thought not to be affected by temperature, at least not very much, or by chemistry and so on. And so it seems like it's a really good clock. And so if you pick up a rock on Earth and it's got some uranium and some lead in it, you could extrapolate backwards and figure out when the rock was all uranium.
Actually, no, you couldn't. Not with uranium, at least. You can't radiometrically date things using an isotope that's half-life can be affected by things other than time, and uranium is so easy to affect with things other than time that they use it in nuclear reactors to produce electricity.
But how do you know it was all uranium to begin with? Maybe the rock had some lead in it to begin with when it was first created, right?
Which is also why it's extremely important to know how exactly that rock formed and what kind of environment it was in. So you know how much of the radioactive material versus its half-life variance the rock started out with and should have. As a result, there are surprisingly few rock types that can actually be radioactively dated. But once you find one and then date it, it's safe to bet that the other rocks around it on the same layer are also probably about the same age.
So you'd have to know what it started with, right? Well, how do I know what it started with?
As I just said, by knowing how it formed and what kind of environment it was in.
Well, you tell me how old you want the rock to be, and I'll tell you what it started with. You see?
That might be how it works with creationists, but in science, want is irrelevant. All that matters is verifiable evidence.
And by the way, evolutionists do not assume that it started with all uranium. They assume that it had some lead in it to begin with.
We also don't use uranium for radiometric dating.
In a way, it's the same way that you can keep time with an hourglass. Now, I think you can keep time with an hourglass if certain assumptions are met. I mean, if you came in here and I had an hourglass, starting when you first came in here and it looked like that, it looked like it does on the screen with about halfway through, and I say, how long ago did I turn that over? That's easy. It's an hourglass, halfway done, half an hour, right? I say, oh, I got you, because in fact it was sideways when I first came in. Already a lot of the sand was in the bottom chamber. You see, you assumed that all the sand started in the top chamber.
This is an excellent example of why you also need to know what kind of environment the rock was found in. Here you're trying to tell what time it is by only considering the hourglass by itself in its current state. And because you didn't know the environmental information, you don't know that he had it on its side.
Which would be like assuming the rock was all uranium to begin with, and that wasn't the case.
Again, we don't use uranium, and we can know by looking at its environmental information. If your environmental information is incomplete, then you won't get accurate results.
Or how do you know that somebody didn't come and add sand to the hourglass when you weren't looking?
That would be part of the environmental information that would be needed to know and accounted for.
Right? That would affect your age estimate. And in fact, in rocks, certain chemicals like uranium are leachable in salt water. They can actually move in and out of the rock. It's possible for that to happen.
Again, that's why uranium and other isotopes that can be affected by things other than time are not used. Also, why environmental information needs to be taken into account.
Or how do you know the throat of the bottle has always been the same size? Even if the throat was wide, it's probably realistic for an hourglass, but we think that the rate at which radioactivity occurs can change. We know it can change under certain circumstances because we can do it. Certain kinds of radioactivity have been accelerated by a factor of 1 billion in laboratories.
Again, that's why we don't use those isotopes for radiometric dating.
And so if it can happen in laboratories, it can probably happen outside of laboratories too.
It does. That's why we don't use those isotopes. Also, your slide there is kind of wrong. When they radiometric date something, they don't make assumptions. If there is even one thing they aren't sure about, they don't do the tests, as it would be a waste of time and resources.
So basically, these are some of the assumptions involved in radiometric dating. That the initial conditions are known, that the decay rate is constant. We have very good evidence that number 2 is wrong.
That's a bold statement. Do you mean that the decay rates of all radioactive isotopes are wrong? If so, what's your evidence?
And for that reason, the estimated ages of these rocks are going to be very much inflated because they assume that the decay rate's been constant when in fact it hasn't.
So you're not going to show us evidence? You're just going to reassert it as if it's fact? Okay, well, I'm convinced by the merits of your argument.
But regardless of these details, I want you to take home this bottom line. Here's the bottom line. We've tested rocks of known age, and they fail in terms of getting the right radiometric age estimate. Mount St. Helens, for example, when it erupted in 1980, and there were some subsequent eruptions, we took some brand new rocks that had formed from the magma, and that's supposed to set the 0 point for the radiometric clocks.
No, just because a rock just formed doesn't mean you'll get an age of 0. You also have to take into account of how it formed and the environment it was found in.
And we sent them in and had them radiometrically dated, which you normally wouldn't do because it's expensive. Why would you test it on a rock of known age, right? Well, because we wanted to check the method. We wanted to see if the method works.
But the method only works if you do it right, which you clearly didn't.
And these brand new rocks came back with estimated ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years.
Which is about what you would expect the results to show if you didn't take into account how it formed and where it was found. Rocks can't be blindly dated. The environmental information is also required.
On brand new rocks. You say, well, that's an isolated incident.
No, the argument is that you didn't do it right. Bad results are what you get every time you don't do a test right.
It's not. If you go to Hawaii and you take a rock from Hawaii and have it radiometrically dated, a brand new rock, you saw it come out of the volcano, you could stick your pike in it and let it cool right there and send it in, you will get millions of years.
Right, because you're not taking into account how it formed or what environment you found it in.
Pretty consistently. So the bottom line is radiometric dating has been shown to not work on rocks of known age.
No, it has been shown not to work if you do the tests wrong.
And yet evolutionists assume it works on rocks of unknown age.
Scientists have demonstrated time and time again that radiometric dating works when done right.
Now, to me, that's a lot of blind faith right there.
Don't project your faults onto people who will not share them.
That's not a reasonable faith. We all have faith. That's not a reasonable faith. Because when you test it and it doesn't work in little things, how can you trust it in large things? That's kind of a biblical principle, isn't it?
So, wait, you're saying that's a bad thing to do with the Bible? Does that mean that you don't believe in creationism, or that the Bible is historically accurate?
If I gave you a calculator and you put 2 plus 2 equals, and it gave you 67,521.
Then I would return the calculator, because something clearly went wrong in its manufacturing process. But are you suggesting we also do that with the Bible? Because I think it's supposed to be that way.
And I said, well, no, don't worry, it works on big numbers. So I don't think I trust that. I don't think I would trust it with big numbers.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust the Bible with any numbers, since it continuously gets them wrong.
What about carbon dating? Now, carbon dating is a little better, because we think the acceleration of the radioactive decay didn't affect carbon as much.
What acceleration of radioactive decay? Was there some sort of event that accelerated the decay rates of all radioactive materials that I didn't get the memo about? What are you even talking about?
But people have heard of carbon dating and they think it gives billions of years. It doesn't, nor could it, because C14 decays very quickly. I'll come back to that. But carbon dating is one type of this radiometric dating, but with carbon dating, it tends to give the right answer. And when we test it on things of known age, it tends to give reasonable answers. Now, it's not infallible either, but it tends to give answers that are consistent with what we'd expect when tested on things of known age. And the idea with carbon dating is there's a certain variety of carbon. Most carbon is C12. There's a certain variety of it that's C14. It's got 2 extra neutrons, and it's radioactive. C12 is stable. C14, radioactive. And a small fraction of that is in the atmosphere that we're breathing right now. It's in the food that you eat. It's incorporated into your body. So a small fraction of you is C14. So you're all slightly unstable. How about that? You knew that, though, right? And while you're alive, I mean, that C14 is constantly decaying into nitrogen, but when you're alive, you're replacing it because you're eating new food, you're breathing air, and so on. You're exchanging carbon with your environment, and so you replenish it. But when you die, it simply decays away. And so the idea is by measuring the C14 to C12 in something, you can tell how long ago it died. And we find that it tends to give the right answer. And the interesting thing is it gives the right answer that creationists would expect, even on things that evolutionists believe to be millions of years old.
Well, carbon dating only works for things up to 50,000 years old. So no scientist that knows the subject will tell you that things have been carbon dated to millions of years old. Also, sunlight is what turns carbon-12 into carbon-14. So it's probably very easy to make something look younger than it actually is by leaving it outside in direct sunlight for a while.
Like coal beds. You can take a chunk of coal, it'll have C14 in it.
Right, because it was exposed to sunlight, and you didn't take that into account.
Every time. You won't find an exception to that.
If it's exposed to sunlight, then yes, it would have carbon-14 in it.
And yet, if if the entire Earth were nothing but C14, after 1 million years, you would not have a single atom left. That's how quickly it decays.
Yes, you would, because sunlight is what makes it carbon-14. Now, if there had been no sunlight for 1 million years, then that would be different.
And yet they find it in coal beds that they think are hundreds of millions of years old. Can't be that old. The C14 would be gone. We've even found C14 in diamonds.
Sure, leave the diamonds in direct sunlight for a while, and when you come back and test them, you'll find C14 in them.
Diamonds that evolutionists believe to be 1 to 2 billion years old based on these other radiometric methods, and yet there's C14 in them.
Right, that's because they were exposed to sunlight.
They can't be that old. They can't be more than a few thousand years old.
Just because you contaminated the test samples with sunlight doesn't mean they can't still be that age.
Isn't that interesting? And they say, well, there must be some kind of contamination. How? It's a diamond. It's the hardest substance. How are you going to get new C14 in there?
It's called sunlight. You just have to leave them outside for a while, and it happens.
Does it make any sense?
It makes perfect sense if you understand science, which I do realize you're paid not to.
We've even carbon dated dinosaur fossils. You know, sometimes with fossils, if there's enough carbon left, you can actually carbon date them. And every one that we've tested has C14 in it. They're all thousands of years old.
Right, because you contaminated the samples with sunlight. Or I suppose they weren't actually dinosaur fossils. Creationists have been known to forge false evidence to support their beliefs. And I think we'll end part 3 here.